Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Pramod. I'm one of the consultant endocrinologists at Integra Healthcare. And just quickly move on to what I will be covering in this next hour. So basically, I will be looking at the challenges of climate change and type 2 diabetes and obesity. I will be presenting the pathophysiologies of obesity and type 2 diabetes. I will be talking about what is called as the twindemics, so basically the intertwined nature of climate change and obesity. I will also be talking about food system and its contribution to climate change and metabolic diseases, and also about the measures to tackle food systems and obesogenic environment to help reduce emissions as well as promote health culture. And I will be covering some aspects of the modern management of type 2 diabetes and obesity, focusing on sustainability. I have to admit that I'm not a climate scientist, nor am I a public health expert, but I just wanted to present some of the perspectives from an endocrinologist's point of view. So, if we look at the global prevalence of overweight and obesity, we have seen many slides about prevalence. You can see that the prevalence of overweight and obesity is high among both sexes and pretty much among all adult age groups. And if you look at any super region in the world, none of them are spared. If you think that some of the South Asian and Sub-Saharan population have got low prevalence, the rate of rise in obesity and overweight is way higher there, that in time you're going to be seeing major problems in these regions as well. So this is data from a recent Lancet paper, which is fairly up to date. And if you project this into the future, what you can see is that the rate of rise is still going up, and as I said, even more so in some of the areas where you have got low prevalence of obesity. And if you look at some of the highest prevalence areas, by 2050, you can expect every other person, if not more, to be actually obese. Okay, so the majority of people are going to be obese by 2050 if nothing is done about this. And if you combine the overweight and the obese population, you're looking at the majority globally being in that group as opposed to the people who have got a normal BMI. What about type 2 diabetes? Now, this is data from the International Diabetes Federation Diabetes Atlas 2025. You can see since 2000, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is gradually going up at a fast pace to the extent that it is fourfold compared to how it was in 2000. And this trend is continuing. And if you look at some of the projections of prevalence that were made in the past, you can see that they were pretty much underestimates. So you're going to be seeing more and more obese type 2 diabetes patients in your clinics, and there is no sign of any reduction in this. How about locally in our own Cayman Islands? If you look at the STEP survey, this has been shown several times. I do apologize for the repetition, but it is still worth saying about this. 70% of the population are either overweight or obese currently. And if you look at type 2 diabetes, 1 in 10 have got diabetes, and this is likely to be an underestimate because a lot of people who, a lot of a percentage of the population have not actually had their blood sugars checked. So this is clearly going to be an underestimate. Now, if you look at the obesity projections that I showed you, and put Cayman Islands in the Latin American and Caribbean supergroup, you can see that pretty much the obesity percentage is around 33%. So it's bang on there, which is in line with what the STEP survey show. And if you project that into the future, you can see that 1 in 2 will become obese by 2050. So pretty alarming numbers here. How about the global temperatures? So over the last 100 years, you have seen a steady rise in global temperatures, and we are now 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial era. And if you look at the rate of rise in temperatures over the last 40 years, you can see a 0.5 degree rise in temperatures every decade leading up to now. Now, if you project this, even if you have the best case scenario of reduction in carbon emissions, where you have a sudden drop in carbon emissions today, and then it keeps dropping, you're still going to see a rise in temperature. But we know that that's not the case. Temperatures are still going to rise, so that by the time you reach up to 2050, you're going to have at least around 2 degrees rise in temperatures, which is quite scary. And how is this happening? This is essentially because of rise in greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from CO2 emissions, and also through methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. And these are, as you can see, only continuing to rise. And if you look at emissions from sectors, 2/3 of them are coming from combustion of fuels and 1/3 from other processes. If you look at potential solutions to reduce emissions, pretty much you have got renewables and hydrogen and biofuels to reduce fossil fuel, and you've got forest and grassland management. But more importantly, pertaining to this talk, it's about the intensity of food production system, reduction of waste, food waste and loss, and sustainable and healthy diet and behavioral changes. Now, I just wanted to talk about a concept called as planetary boundaries, which was proposed in 2009 by a group of eminent scientists, because the problem here is not just about climate change alone. We have got several indices that are being monitored, which are rapidly changing as a result of human activities. And climate change is just one of them. You've got biosphere integrity, land system changes, freshwater changes, flow of phosphorus and nitrogen into the atmosphere, and several others, which, if they cross tipping points, can provide a cascade effect, which will result in a rapid deterioration of the system with the Earth system. So the planetary boundaries was formulated by a group of multidisciplinary scientists, and it monitors how things have been changing since 2009, and we have got more and more data coming out. And this is what was the scenario in 2009, where 7 boundaries were assessed for tipping points, and 3 had already crossed by then. And then in 2015, 4 had crossed, and 2023, you've got 6 that have crossed. And currently, you've got an additional boundary that has been crossed. So you've got 7 out of 9 that have already been crossed. So it's a pretty delicate scenario here. And I just want to leave this picture because I'll be coming back to this again later in the talk. But I just want to move back to my comfort zone, which is type 2 diabetes and the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes, because it is important to understand this in the context of the rise in prevalence of obesity and type 2 diabetes and also climate change. So people have always thought of type 2 diabetes as something in terms of an hyperglycemia where you don't really know the cause. Is it a bit of insulin resistance? Is it a bit of beta cell failure? Is it a bit of fat tissue deposition? We didn't have a good idea of the precise pathophysiology until we had bariatric surgery for obesity. So once people have had bariatric surgery, and if they happen to have type 2 diabetes, you suddenly find that your blood sugars are getting back to normal within a few days of having surgery. And why should that be? So that was when this hypothesis, it's a slightly busy slide, I do apologize. The twin cycle hypothesis was proposed at that time. So essentially, you are starting off with a long-term positive calorie balance. And that is thanks to the obesogenic environment that we have. Once you have a positive calorie balance, if you have a genetic predisposed pre-existing muscle insulin resistance, you tend to store less of the energy in your muscle than you would normally do. So that spills over into the liver, and it is stored as liver fat. Once you have an increase in liver fat, your insulin resistance rises and you spill fat into the system. And then it gets stored as subcutaneous fat. Again, this is genetically determined as to how much fat you can store under your skin. Once that capacity exceeds, then you start to release fatty acid into your circulation. And this has got a particular liking for the insulin-producing cells. And then your insulin production starts to fall. Once your insulin production starts to fall, your blood sugars rise. Until then, your blood sugars have been staying normal. You have no idea what's been going on. Okay. Once your blood sugars start to rise, that is even more toxic to your beta cells that produce insulin, and your blood sugar rises further. So you've got a vicious cycle of ongoing progressive insulin resistance happening in your liver, and you've got another insulin resistance that is happening in the pancreas. So this twin cycle is what seems to be proposed as a unifying cause for type 2 diabetes. And how do we prove it? You start with the stage number 1, which is the long-term positive calorie balance, and try to reverse it. So this is one of the first studies that was done in 2005, where people with type 2 diabetes who were overweight were fed with a low-calorie diet, and what you found was that the fat levels in your liver fell, and your insulin resistance in your liver also improved, okay? But that doesn't still prove that twin cycle. It only proved one of the cycles within the liver. You still need to demonstrate that your insulin levels are rising. So this is a study from 2012, which looked at type 2 diabetes, where you had low-calorie diet and you attained a weight loss of 15 kilograms on an average. And what you found was that your blood sugar levels actually normalized, and so did your triglycerides, which is a marker of the fatty acid release from the liver, okay? Not just that, your insulin response to high blood sugars also improved. So purely from reducing weight, in people with type 2 diabetes, your insulin response improves. Is this sustainable? A further 2-year study where you have got people with type 2 diabetes who went into remission, which is in blue, and stayed in remission. You find that the insulin response constantly is getting better. So this is clearly sustainable, and the lower you can keep your body fat, your insulin production improves. So that clearly proves that the twin cycle hypothesis is true, and this was again proved in a randomized controlled trial in clinic settings, and to see if that would work in actual practice. And the answer is yes, it did. This was a large-scale trial done in the UK with predominantly primary care involvement, where you had diabetes specialist nurses and dietitians giving advice on liquid low-calorie diet for 12 to 20 weeks, a total of around 800 calories per day. So it's a pretty low-calorie diet. And then you step up the food reintroduction over 2 weeks. and then offer structured support thereafter for a period of 2 years. And what you find that you attain weight loss, and if you look at the people who had around 15 kg weight loss, your diabetes went into remission in about 86% of the people. So it's quite a powerful example here as to how your long-term positive calorie balance and excessive fat in places where you shouldn't have them is causing type 2 diabetes, and it can be reversed in normal clinical practice. Okay, so low liquid calorie diet is a viable treatment option for reversal of early type 2 diabetes. Can you sustain it in real practice? The same trial had a follow-up for 5 years, and what you find is that although you lost the weight, you are tending to regain most of the weight that you lost. And if you look at people who are highly motivated, who wanted to be part of the trial in the follow-up, they actually did better, but even in those groups, you still find weight regain happening. But you still find that your HbA1c levels and the number of medications you need to control your glucose levels are actually, your HbA1c level still stays lower compared to the other groups, and you're on lesser medications to control your diabetes. So weight loss through calorie restriction is effective, but prolonged remission is not common. So this is in people who are overweight, but we do see a lot of people with normal BMI who have diabetes. Do they have a different etiology, or can we apply the twin cycle hypothesis to them? And the answer is yes. This is another trial which looked at weight loss because they were not having a high BMI. They were subjected to a stepwise reduction in their weight through low-calorie diet, followed by a phase where they maintained the weight, and then followed again by a low-calorie diet to lose weight, and so on and so forth. And you find the same result here in that your subcutaneous body fat, your intra-abdominal body fat comes down, and look at your HbA1c, it falls. So what this tells you is your body's ability to store fat subcutaneously, which is the benign metabolically inactive fat, is genetic. And if you have a very low capacity to store fat in the subcutaneous tissue, you are more at risk of getting type 2 diabetes even with normal BMI. But the process is still the same. And this is again taking things even further outside of clinical trial. Now what happens in the UK in the NHS is that if you get type 2 diabetes, you are offered this path to remission program where you get automatically referred, and if you're willing to take it up, you get low-calorie diet advice. And if you look at the 1-year data there, you see a remission of around 32%, which, yeah, is not as impressive as the clinical trial data, but this is real world. Okay, so the cause of type 2 diabetes is pretty much a positive calorie balance over the years, thanks to the obesogenic environment. Okay. Everything else is genetically determined. So if you have, if your subcutaneous fat capacity exceeds, or if you have muscle insulin resistance, or if you have beta cell susceptibility to the excess fatty acids, all these are genetically determined. So this is like a Swiss cheese effect, where you've got all these holes, which are all genetically determined, but what you pour at the top is the obesogenic environment. The holes all fall in place, you get type 2 diabetes. Now let's look at obesity. So we are now moving to why we are having this positive calorie balance in the first place. Why should that be? So if you look at obesity and want to call it as a disease, I would call it as a disease of fat or adiposopathy. because it is a fat tissue where you have these metabolic processes happening, and that is what is causing the end organ damage, like type 2 diabetes or fatty liver disease or hypertension, sleep apnea, and so on. You also have direct effects from excess adipose tissue causing mechanical problems like sleep apnea and osteoarthritis. So there is a sound argument to call obesity as a disease. Now, pretty much if you look at family studies and twin studies and adopted children studies, what you find is that there is a 60% contribution through genetics towards obesity. And what is the other supportive evidence for this? So our genes haven't changed in 1950. We still have the same genes, but what has changed is the environment. So if it was nothing to do with your genes, but just the environment, everyone will become bigger. A person with a BMI of 19 will become BMI of 22, 25 will become 28, and so on. That's not what we see in real world. You see a skewed deviation here. So some people get very obese, some people are staying the same. And that strongly suggests that there are multiple genes involved in this process. And quite often quoted phrase is genes load the gun, but the environment is pulling the trigger. So it's the environment that's driving it, but it is genes that is causing the diversity in the adiposity here. And where are these genes playing a role? So you've got the environment-brain interface. So all these environmental factors like the ultra-processed energy-dense food, the diet, physical activity or inactivity, medications, alcohol, aging, sleep deprivation, environmental pollution, all these messages are interpreted by your brain differently if you have different genetic makeup. And then once your brain has made a best guess of what is going on, it sends out signals which is resulting in the physiology and the behavior that you see. So you have more hunger or less hunger, and more energy intake or normal energy intake or less energy intake, and the same with the energy expenditure, and also where your fuel, your fat is being partitioned into. And as a result, you see a variation in your BMIs. And you've got various hormones which are providing information to your brain, which are in your gut, pancreas, fat tissue, and you've also got nerves which provide information about how full your stomach is or what nutrients are there. And then your brain has got appetite-stimulating neurons and appetite-suppressing neurons in your hypothalamus, which collate all this information and then gives you feelings of hunger and so on. So pretty complicated system here. And hence, when you try to lose weight, you're seeing weight regain after a few years. Losing the weight in the first instance is easy, but then maintaining it seems difficult. Why is that? Weight loss tends to cause a reduction in your energy expenditure, which is a normal thing, but what you see is a reduction in the energy expenditure, which is more than what you would expect for that weight loss. That is number one. And then when you have weight loss, your signals to your brains are altered, and your brain is put in a mode where it wants to eat more to conserve that energy. So the combination means that in this tug of war, weight gain inevitably is winning over weight loss. But there are some people who lose weight and sustain the weight loss. If you look at this database from the US, where it's essentially a self-reported database, where people report about their successful weight loss and weight maintenance, and about their behaviors, you do find a pattern here. This is from the National Weight Control Registry in the US. And they've got a database of thousands of people who have lost weight and have sustained weight. And it's all self-reported data, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt. But the general pattern you see here is that these people tend to stay on a low-calorie diet long-term. So on an average, between 1,300 and 1,600 calories a day. It's a pretty low calorie diet on a long-term basis. They eat breakfast every day. Don't know whether that matters. They do frequent self-monitoring. They look at their weight, they count their calories pretty much every day, and they are making changes according to what they see. And they have an hour of moderate physical activity every day. They have very limited television viewing. When they go on holidays, they still maintain this routine. Real life doesn't always work like that. And so you have to wonder, do these people have any special genetic makeup that helps them have this behavior? Rather than trying to impose this on everybody. So it is quite easy to say, yes, you've got energy expenditure less than the energy that is going in, and so it's all down to the ultra-dense, energy-dense, ultra-processed, cheap food and reduced physical activity, giving rise to obesity. And it's all about lack of discipline, and losing weight is all about willpower. Probably not. There are more factors, as you can see, playing a role here. So let's just shift focus again, going back to the climate change and how these might be linked, because again, we are going to be seeing more factors that are influencing obesity here. So as we know, we're facing two major problems here, obesity as well as climate change. And if you look at the secular curves in this slide, you can see that the rise in climate change as well as obesity seems to be running in parallel, seemingly suggesting that there may be several ways in which they are interconnected. There might be common driving factors. There might be unidirectional or bidirectional relationships, and more importantly, perhaps some of the solutions to these problems might well reside in how best we can tackle them simultaneously. Okay. So does climate change or does global warming actually contribute to obesity? And I tried to look into the evidence for it. There is a number of papers written on it. Unfortunately, it's not like a standard medical literature review where you can try and infer the quality of some of these papers. But still, I mean, there's a lot of modeling work, but certainly there is an association. Proving causation is difficult, and these are a couple of large studies. The one on the left is a study which involved around 150 countries over 50 years and monitoring the temperature variability and BMI. And you do find a very strong correlation between temperature rises and rise in obesity. And this is a similar study involving children and women, particularly where you see a stronger correlation between temperature variability and BMI. Now, why would that be? I mean, there are several plausible mechanisms whereby this can happen. The greenhouse gas emissions could potentially lead to oxidative metabolism through various factors, and this in turn triggers an increased food intake. that might be one mechanism. Now, you have a type of adipose tissue called as brown adipose tissue. You've got brown and white adipose tissue. Brown is protective and mainly involved in thermogenesis when you're in cold climate. So there are studies which show that if you stay in a thermally comfort zone, like if you're in a warm climate and you're sitting in AC, or if you're in a cold climate and you are pretty much in the comfort zone with the heating on, your brown adipose tissue tends to fall. So you tend to produce less heat, which means that you tend to gain weight. So that might be another factor here. Obviously, if you have extremes of temperatures, you're less likely to be physically active, leading to a sedentary lifestyle. Again, with processed food, it may be calorie dense, but may not be nutrient dense. And if you have protein deficiency, the protein has got a strong thermogenic factor. But if you're not consuming enough protein, then you may not be producing enough thermogenesis to be actually in a weight loss state. Okay. And obviously, with the impact of temperature and the food availability and consumption globally, you have got more reliance on processed food, which might be another indirect factor here. What about pollution? So pollution, there is lots of evidence, especially in children, that it can be a big predisposing factor to obesity with oxidative changes in the adipose tissue, increasing your blood pressure, increasing the risk of asthma, and you tend to stay indoors and have sedentary behaviors. All these things can contribute to obesity. So if you look at the overall picture, there may be several factors which might contribute to obesity when you have global warming and pollution combined together. How about the other way? Can obesity cause global warming? Possibly. You've got transportation issues. You're more reliant on motorized transport and less reliant on walking and cycling. And also, there is more energy waste from transportation because of that. And so your greenhouse gases increase and you get global warming and pollution. And also the food process, which we'll come to, again, can cause an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is a very powerful slide, which is looking at the socioeconomic factors. Now, we know that there are genes which predispose us to obesity. And there is the environmental driver that is driving the obesity epidemic. But there is also an important factor here, which is the socioeconomic status. So now, if you look at the era before there was the environmental driver, you still had people who were obese, but it was a small number, and that is because they had too many genes which was contributing to obesity, which meant that even if the environment wasn't driving it, they will still become obese. That is still the case, but on top of that, you've got the environmental predisposition, and so you would have thought that it is a well-off, higher socioeconomic status people who would be obese, which is true, but then what has taken off is that you're finding more and more people in the lower strata of the society becoming obese, and this gap is going to widen further and further. And that is because you have got people living in challenging life circumstances who are already exposed to poor diet right from the start, and then their height is affected, and they have poor access to healthy food, limited opportunity for physical activity, financial constraints, constant stress, and also they are the people who are more exposed to some of the climate changes. How about the sedentary lifestyle and the environment, the built environment? So clearly with the built environment and the urbanization, we have seen a reduction in physical activity. And indeed, there seems to be a 15% drop in physical fitness on a global scale compared to earlier generations, thanks to the urban environment contributing to this. And also, the same environment is contributing towards environmental degradation as well. Now, we can say this, but do we have any evidence to say that built environment can influence your physical activity? We have heard quite a few talks today about the built environment and having more greenery and so on, helping to increase your, to improve from your sedentary lifestyle. But is there any evidence that it works? This is a recent paper that came out in the Nature this year. So we're looking at nationwide relocation of people in the United States. So we're looking at people who here have relocated from New York, so this is the blue slide, towards other parts of the country. Now, New York is a highly walkable city where you have to walk quite a lot of places for your day-to-day activities. So as soon as you get there, you start walking more. And if you look at the pedometer and steps data from app-based step data of all these participants from this trial, you have actually got a lot of mini experiments from each of these relocations. And what you see is that within days of relocating to New York, they automatically increase their step count significantly, straight away. So you don't really need anybody to tell them. The built environment will automatically influence your behavior. And exactly the opposite happens. If you move from New York to other parts of the country, you become more sedentary. And it is not just New York. Any walkable city in the country, if you walk from a more walkable environment to a less walkable environment, you walk less automatically, and vice versa. And this is irrespective of age, your underlying weight, and your underlying physical activity. It's just a uniform behavioral change. Very powerful statement for policymakers to do something about this. And how does that translate to health benefits? Again, a very recent paper, which a lot of people would have seen on social media. You don't really need to walk 10,000 steps. 10,000 steps was the message that was trumped to us. It's either 10,000 or nothing. You don't need that. You only need around 5,000 to 7,000 steps to gain metabolic benefits in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction, cancer risk reduction, and dementia. And if you look at conditions like type 2 diabetes and depression, the more you walk, the better. Now, coming to food systems, so the Eat Lancet Commission was a commission that was appointed in 2019 to look at the planetary systems that we discussed, to discuss about how food systems contribute to the various planetary boundaries, and what can be done about this in terms of a global diet plan to help not just with the environment, but also with the health of the population. And this has been revised in 2025 with a more up-to-date document which talks about the global food system's share of all the 9 planetary boundaries that we discussed, but it also discusses about justice with a human rights framing so that you have right to food, healthy environment, and decent work. And there is solid evidence behind some of the dietetic recommendations that have been put forth here. If you look at the food systems right from the production to consumption to waste, you've got a staggering contribution to all of these planetary boundaries to the extent that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are contributed to by food systems. And it is driving the 5 of the 9 planetary boundaries, transgression. So even if you meet the greenhouse gas emissions target, but did nothing about the food systems, you will still go above the 1.5 degrees cutoff proposed by the Paris Agreement. So what is this planetary diet? So it is a diet which obviously it is nutritionally adequate and is predominantly whole or minimally processed, and more importantly, compatible with cultures worldwide and dietary patterns worldwide. And if you shift to this dietetic pattern, you can potentially save around 15 million deaths a year globally. And what does this diet involve? Basically, you increase your fruit and veg, drastically reduce your red meat consumption, reduce other meat and fish consumption and egg consumption, have more whole grains and more plant protein, and some amount of unsaturated plant oils and a little bit of added sugar. And in addition to the healthy diet, if you improve the productivity and the waste processes, you have significant reduction in global emissions. And if you look at how different regions in the world compare in terms of the planetary diet, the dashed line vertically is where you would want your planetary diet to be for various types of food. And you can see the West is leading in red meat excess consumption, and some amount of poultry, a large amount of root consumption. And if you look at South Asian population and sub-Saharan population, they probably need to up some of the protein consumption and their fruit and veg consumption. So if you achieve that, it's a win-win scenario. Simple, job done. But it's not as easy as that. You can see very few countries are actually achieving it in a just manner, so that everyone is getting the benefits. So you want to get it in a just fashion. So this is a social foundation status. If you consider 100 as the optimum, anything above that is a just space. And if you look at how the risks in terms of transgressing the planetary boundaries are put on the y-axis, you can see that pretty much either you are in an unjust environment or in an unsafe environment, or both. So there is a lot of work to be done, and the document actually provides solutions in terms of action plans with a view to achieving these goals, which is important for policymakers. And I've taken some of the action plans, like taxation on unhealthy food, reduction ad restrictions on unhealthy foods, social protection measures, school meal programs. So there's quite a load of fairly obvious things, but it needs to be done in a concerted global manner in order to make this achievable. So it's a daunting task ahead if we are to go in this direction. Obviously, there are going to be barriers, and I've just put the top 3: corporate interests, political leadership, and weak and fragmented demand for action. Right, now back to my own safe operating sphere. I will just conclude with a few slides on modern management of type 2 diabetes and obesity. So let's start with type 2 diabetes. Now, what we have seen in terms of the pathophysiology needs to be borne in mind when we are dealing with someone with type 2 diabetes, because we have got a unifying cause for type 2 diabetes, and we just drive straight into that once we get the diagnosis right. But it is important to get the diagnosis right, because you want to make the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes without any question. So usually it is obvious. You have a high clinical probability because they've got several features of type 2 diabetes, including insulin resistance features, metabolic syndrome, and you make the diagnosis straight away. Sometimes it may not be straightforward, and you may have to exclude type 1 diabetes, monogenic causes of diabetes, and secondary diabetes before you can be certain that they have got type 2 diabetes, because what you don't want to do is calorie restrict in someone with type 2 diabetes and end up with disasters. So getting the diagnosis is right. Once you get the diagnosis right, the focus really should be, what can you do to reverse the condition? And it doesn't necessarily have to be low-calorie diet on its own. Not everyone is going to tolerate that. How can we use the pharmacotherapy that we have in conjunction with lifestyle to actually reverse the process? So this is the draft NICE guideline, which is supposed to come out next year for the management of type 2 diabetes in adults. And you can see it's out for consultation at the moment. I don't anticipate too many changes on this. There is diet recommendations on low-calorie and very low-calorie diet. That's going to be in the guideline. And once you make a diagnosis, you want to use medications that are not just going to be controlling your blood sugars, but you want to be looking at reducing the risk of long-term outcomes. And so irrespective of your blood sugars, the recommendation is that you start people on metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors. I wouldn't be talking too much about SGLT2 because that's slightly outside the scope of the theme of this talk. But in terms of sustainability and reducing outcomes and reversing diabetes, this is a major shift in guidelines for type 2 diabetes. And if you have, for example, if you have got atherosclerosis and type 2 diabetes, the recommendation is to start pretty much straight away on metformin, SGLT2, and GLP-1 agonists. So this is a huge change. A lot of us are doing this already in clinics, but this is how we need to be viewing the disease process and how we can deliver precision care for individuals. And why has this come about? From a GLP-1 perspective, if you look at the history of GLP-1s, the first GLP-1 that was used was exenatide in 2005, and 10 years later, you've got data for positive cardiovascular outcomes in type 2 diabetes with liraglutide in 2016. And since then, you've had stronger GLP-1s, and we have had even better cardiovascular outcomes. So there is no doubt that you have to treat this just like you would use a statin, for example, in someone with high cardiovascular risk. Okay, now coming to obesity, in terms of diagnosis, you're not just going to be relying on BMI alone. BMI of 30 is useful as a screening process and in epidemiology, but it does have its pitfalls. So you are strongly encouraged to add an additional marker or two in terms of your visceral or your body fat percentage or your visceral fat index. And you are encouraged to use waist circumferences or waist to hip ratio or waist to height ratio and take into account the racial differences for these. And if you use BMI and if one of your body size measurements fits the criteria, then you can say you've got obesity. And if you have a BMI of less than 30 and you satisfy two other criteria for body composition, you can classify them as obese. And if you use this classification, your obesity rates are going to increase by probably around 10 to 20% at least. And that is a huge shift because, as we heard from our previous talk from Dr. Quinter, there is a strong correlation between body fat and outcomes rather than BMI and outcomes. And if you don't meet the criteria, you don't have obesity. So you may have a BMI of 35, but your body fat on various measures are fine. You don't have obesity. So they are out of the pathway. And if they have obesity, you look for signs of organ dysfunction, so metabolic complications, or direct effects of body fat on your body. So that is pretty much why obesity is more and more viewed as a disease now because you've got that direct fat effect on the human body. And if you don't have any of those, you classify them as preclinical obesity. And if they have, then you classify them as clinical obesity. Now, if you look at previous guidelines, say 10 years back, to manage obesity, there was very little that was available. You had lifestyle measures, which we know tends to cause reaccumulation of weight, even if they work initially. And then you had bariatric surgery, which even the eligible patients, if you look at the UK and the US, less than 1% of eligible patients get bariatric surgery. So you're sort of stuck in the middle here, and there is nothing to offer there, apart from pharmacotherapy, which made effectively no difference whatsoever. Those have changed, again, with additional pharmacotherapy, mainly in the form of GLP-1, and we have got GLP-1s, which were initially approved for obesity in 2014 with liraglutide, and then we also have cardiovascular outcome data for obesity, even in the absence of metabolic diseases with GLP-1. So you have had generations of GLP-1 over the last 20 years, starting from exenatide in 2005, right down to quiet, powerful GLP-1s, which can give you 15 to 25% weight loss. And these are the approvals and the indications for their approvals historically, and we're going to be having more. Okay, so we know that GLP-1s are here to stay. Will they cure obesity pandemic? No, they won't. Will they make a difference? Yes, they will. Mainly by difference in outcomes to people who have obesity. And so this is a very recent guideline that has been proposed by the European Association for the Study of Obesity. And they have taken the Lancet diagnostic criteria for obesity and a proposed management solution to this, which includes lifestyle measures, but also has pharmacotherapy indications. So even if you have preclinical obesity, the guidelines approve the use of GLP-1s to reduce their body weight, to reduce the risk of clinical obesity. And if you have outcomes, you are advised to use medications which have got the best evidence for those outcomes. Like, for example, if you have cardiovascular disease, semaglutide has got the best evidence. And if you've got heart failure, semaglutide and tirzepatide have best evidence. If you have type 2 diabetes, you can use any GLP-1 to reduce your weight, or even other weight loss medication, depending on how much weight loss they would need to reverse their diabetes. And you can see the use of GLP-1s has only been increasing to the extent that about 10 to 12% of people in the US have either used GLP-1 or on GLP-1s. And if you look at how the medications are influencing the food market, you can see that there is reduction in cravings by food type, more so for calorie-dense food. Okay? And if you look at the planetary diet, this is sort of mirroring some of the recommendations of the planetary diet. Fruit and veg cravings, no change. Healthy food, no change. But once you get to the more processed and calorie-dense food, you can see that things are reducing. And if you look at a marketing survey which looked at household purchasing of food, again, you can see a similar trend. So the craving and the purchasing seem to be going hand in hand. But you do have challenges with GLP-1s. Because of the cost, the people who really need it don't have access to it. And even people who can afford it find that they can't in a few months' time, and then they stop. So there's a lot of stopping and restarting that may go on. Insurance does not always cover for all the indications that I mentioned. Mainly they are available as injections, and that has got practical inconveniences. There is the problem with cold chain transport, which is not environmentally friendly, and it has got lots of practical considerations as well. And then when you lose weight, you have to be careful about what is a healthy weight loss and what is an unhealthy weight loss. And you have to have that clinical acumen to pick up an unhealthy weight loss fairly early on before it is too late. There are concerns about long-term benefits. We have data with GLP-1 for 20 years, and that appears to be safe, but there are still understandable concerns which need to be taken into consideration, and there is no safety data in pregnancy yet. So that is another watch the space situation. Let's look at weight gain. What can be done about it? Weight regain after stopping GLP-1. This is a meta-analysis. This is unpublished data that is looking at some of the major trials with GLP-1 where the medication has been stopped, and this is follow-up data looking at how much weight they have regained. You can see that, pretty much in every trial you find weight regain, but at least in 1 year you're not regaining all of the weight that you lost. You're still maintaining a weight deficit, but it is significantly less than at the start of when you stop the GLP-1. So what can be done about weight regain? So there are several sort of methods by which you can reduce or potentially reduce. None of them have got very strong evidence because it's still early days with GLP-1 in terms of obesity. One of them is preservation of muscle mass whilst they're on GLP-1 and trying to lose selectively fat mass as much as possible. Or you may be looking at a slow down titration but not stopping the GLP-1. Or you might be looking at a very slow down titration to eventually stop it, and in the meantime, you sort of encourage behavioral therapies and hope that the altered physiology doesn't kick back in. And you've also got some endoscopic methods that might be showing some early promise, and I can just show you a couple of slides on that as well. So muscle mass preservation, how can we do that? General measures like resistance exercises, protein supplementation, creatine supplementation are all general measures which will help. And in addition, there are medications which act on some of the skeletal muscle receptors which might actually help with preserving muscle mass or muscle gain, and that might again make a difference in terms of the reduction in the weight regain that you will get after cessation of GLP-1 therapy. And there is already some early data with a medication called bimagrumab, which is a selective actin-myosin receptor inhibitor, which used in conjunction with semaglutide has been shown to help lose adipose tissue selectively in those group of patients. There's recent data that was presented at the last American Diabetes Association conference. There may be other medications in the horizon, but again, it's a watch the space for now. What about behavioral therapies? So there is one published trial where you had patients subject to low-calorie diet to help weight loss. So they obviously lost the weight within a few weeks. And then they were divided into 4 groups. One was they just carried on as normal. The other one had exercise only. And the third group had GLP-1. And the fourth group had GLP-1 and exercise. This carried on for a year. The GLP-1 used was liraglutide, and then they stopped the trial, and then they looked at the data 1 year later. And what they found was that the people who were on GLP-1 plus exercise regained the least amount of weight. So there may be a role for supervised exercise programs. Okay. And what about this endoscopic resurfacing? So there have been findings of thickened duodenal lining in people with type 2 diabetes who are obese and people who are obese without type 2 diabetes. And this may well be a change that is happening structurally as a result of long-term calorie excess and sugar. And this structural change might be altering some of the hormonal composition in the gut, giving the wrong message to the brain. So what they tried to do was to endoscopically ablate the duodenal lining and let it grow back again as a healthy lining in people with type 2 diabetes, and they found that their blood sugars improved and the patients lost weight. But this didn't take off because this was done immediately before COVID struck, and probably this was sort of in the back burner for a while. Now with the weight regain issue using GLP-1, this has been tried again as a pilot. This is data, very early pilot study data. This is tirzepatide, 15 milligrams to help lose weight. They had lost about 15% mean weight. And then you had a randomized controlled trial with a sham procedure versus this particular endoscopic resurfacing procedure. And what you find was that the sham group started to regain weight as you would normally expect to, but the endoscopic procedure group actually was having ongoing weight loss on top of the 15% that they had already achieved. So there might be something here, and a longer trial is happening and recruitment is going to end next year, so we will hopefully have some more results on this. Okay, there are new molecules coming out which have got more receptor blockades other than GLP-1. We already have one of those, and there are several in the pipeline, some of them getting 25 to 30% weight loss, and they may actually be also offering some solution in terms of weight gain, because if you have lost 30%, even if you regain some, you might still end up losing only 10% in the end. So there might be new molecules which might have solutions for this problem. And in addition, you've got new indications being tried out, because GLP-1s do have some anti-inflammatory effect. And it is, there are investigational indications, including CNS disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, substance abuse, type 1 diabetes, peripheral artery disease, CKD, where already last week there was a major trial published which showed an improvement in chronic disease outcomes in people with type 2 diabetes on GLP-1s. And you've got trials on psoriatic arthritis, another area of interest, where the anti-inflammatory may have a role. And all these indications where you might find more and more GLP-1 being used may also actually influence obesity and the food industry. And to solve the cold chain problem, there is oral GLP-1 molecules being trialed. One of the issues with peptides like insulin and GLP-1 is that it is quite difficult to make oral molecules, but there is a non-peptide molecule called as orforglipron, which has recently been shown to be highly effective in weight loss and has got a significant HbA1c reduction. So this may actually be something that could be scalable in terms of a GLP-1 medication in the future. But that again depends on the pricing that's going to be placed on top of that. Okay, so this is my concluding slide. So essentially, the modern management of type 2 diabetes cannot happen in isolation with what is happening in the planet. So we have to have a global approach to this. So we have a planetary diet, and looking at our built environment issues and producing a planetary diet within safe boundaries, and also importantly, securing our social foundations happening at a policy level and at a global level. And then when health practitioners are involved, giving the right lifestyle advice, focusing on a planetary diet approach and physical activity advice. And then once you get to actually diagnosing and treating metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and obesity, you need to have a targeted, precision-based advice and management, which will be an interplay of lifestyle, pharmacotherapy, and in some cases, bariatric surgery. And that is going to be, I would anticipate that things would happen in cycles of this. And that is the best we can hope in terms of at least reducing the rate of rise in obesity, and also in terms of improving rates of remission in type 2 diabetes, so that we can keep the prevalence rate of type 2 diabetes as a minimum. Thank you very much.